and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel, and in this video I will be doing a birthday slash sort of Booktuberversary Q&A. In my last monthly reading wrap-up, I asked you to ask me a question or drop a suggestion for something to do to mark my birthday slash Booktuberversary, and a few of you did indeed take up my request and asked a few questions down in the comments of that video, so thank you. And though the questions weren't that numerous, I realized that there was in fact enough material for me to do a Q&A video out of them. So one of you asked me what were some of my favorite non-fiction books. I mean, there's a fair few of them. I tried to keep it to a top 10 list, sort of. I mean, it won't be a top 10 list, but a list of 10 items in any case. Some of the books I'll be mentioning will be representatives of a subject matter I've explored through non-fiction books. I'll mention the book Alex and Me, written by Dr. Irene Pepperberg. That book is at the same time a memoir and a popular science book about the cognitive abilities and more specifically linguistic abilities of African grey parrots. Dr. Irene Pepperberg is known for having worked with African greys to explore the ways they're able to actually use human words in meaningful ways, and her most famous test subject is really not the right word because she had a relationship with that bird, but that bird was Alex. Alex the African grey, who has since passed away. I mean, he died a few years ago now. So she talks about her relationship with Alex and the work she conducted with him and with some of the birds that followed him in that research project, one of whom is called Griffin, I think. It was just such a lovely book, a fascinating book and a very moving book, because I'm a bird nerd and I'm very interested in ethology or, cognitive animal sciences and relationships between humans and non-humans, so that book was right up my alley. Though I've read other books in that vein. I've also read Wesley the Owl, which is a similar type of story, but instead of an African grey parrot, you have a barn owl. And I've read several other books on the cognitive abilities of non-human animals and birds more specifically. In fact, on the subject of birds, I have a video going over all of the books I have about birds, if you're interested. I'm also going to mention A Really Good Day, written by Eilert Waldman. That's a memoir slash non-fiction book about psychedelic medicine, more specifically microdosing LSD for therapeutic purposes. It's a good overview of the current state of psychedelic science and medicine. It's a good overview of what microdosing can do for some people. The author, since she was a lawyer for a large part of her life, also goes over the history of the war on drugs, and of course you can go from there to explore other books about this topic, and I have a fair few of them. In fact, I also did a video going through all the books I have on the subject of psychedelics generally, but then more specifically psychedelic science slash medicine. In French, I would recommend Fantastica by Stéphanie Chaillet, which is more of a journalistic book about psychedelic science and medicine, and is very, very up-to-date as well. And since it doesn't seem to me there are as many books about this topic in French, if you are a French speaker slash reader, I would definitely point you towards that one. Then I would also definitely mention Delusions of Gender, written by Cordelia Fine, but that, once again, kind of stands in for all the books I've read about gender from a neuroscience perspective and debunking gender from a neuroscience perspective. So you can lump into that category Gender Mosaic, which I've read last month, The Gendered Brain by Gina Rippon, or the other book on the subject, sort of, written by Cordelia Fine, Testosterone Rex. But Delusions of Gender was the first book I ever read on that subject, and it was just kind of a revelation for me at that time. Not completely unrelated, so still in the domain of feminism, I guess, I'm going to mention When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. That's more of an analysis of Abrahamic religions and their patriarchal cause, really, and analysing the way those religions replaced somewhat more egalitarian to more matrifocal spiritual slash religious systems, and it was excellent. But then again, I've read other books which tackle that topic as well. There's Sorcière by Mona Chollet, which is somewhat related. There's The Chalice and the Blade, which takes an even more macroscopic approach in a way to the topic. They're all related with all these archetypes around gender, around the oppression of women, around the roles of men and women in society, looking at the religious record, the mythological record, symbols, and all that stuff. I'll also mention Yearning for the Wind. I can't recall the name of the author at the minute, though the book is just over there, but I'm too lazy to go and get it. That's just a book about Celtic-inspired spirituality, or sorry, I'm going to rephrase. So Celtic neo-pagan spirituality, and again, it kind of stands in for all the books I've read and since then kept on neo-paganism, neo-shamanism, that kind of spiritually related stuff. I'm also going to mention, it is non-fiction, but it's illustrated non-fiction, Women in Science by Rachel Ignatowski. I think that's just a brilliant book about that specific topic, uplifting the great female scientists of history. Some of them, there were more than are portrayed in that book, obviously. But that's just a great, informative little piece of feminist-adjacent literature, because it's feminist in the sense that it uplifts female scientists, but it's also just fascinating because it touches upon the history of science and scientific research, and the illustrations are drop-dead gorgeous. I'll also mention a book I read specifically about Lilith, the mythological figure which you find in Jewish variants of the Ancient Testament, but whose roots you can trace back to ancient Mesopotamia as well. Lilith is one of my favorite mythological figures / archetypes. Once again, it's kind of a stand-in for just the plethora of books I have on mythology, world mythology, Celtic mythology, Egyptian mythology, Greco-Roman mythology, mythology out the wazoo. It's one of my great passions in life. So mythology books, but all of the ones I've kept are really good, so I can't really decide which one to pick specifically. I'll also mention the essay Nature, written by Ralph Waldo Emerson. I read it a fair few years ago now. I definitely benefit from a reread. However, I remember really loving that essay. That essay really spoke to me, again, from a, principally spiritual, philosophical point of view. It was fairly short as well, so that's a good example of essay nonfiction I can point to as being a favorite. Though A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf is also up there. And now I'm going to finish off with some graphic nonfiction, because it still counts as nonfiction as far as I'm concerned. There's Dirty Biology, which is right there, a nonfiction book about sex, sexual reproduction, the evolution of sexual reproduction, the wide variety of shapes and forms it takes in the natural world. It's very funny, it's very informative, it's very factual, so I loved that. If you speak French, I would highly recommend it as an example of graphic nonfiction. And then in the collection La Petite Bibliothèque des Savoirs, there's a tome about liberalism, really exploring what liberalism is, or can be, kind of depending on the point of view you take. Are you talking about liberalism in social politics, social morals? Are you talking about liberalism in economics? Because it's not necessarily the same thing. And I've noticed that liberalism means completely different things, whether you're in the United States or in the UK, or UK in Europe. It's a very important topic because it's just very relevant today, because the word liberal and liberalism is used all the bloody time, but in lots of different ways. And so you have to ask, but how exactly are you using that word? More generally, however, that collection of graphic nonfiction is absolutely brilliant. Once again, if you're a francophone, I would highly recommend it. They tackle a wide variety of subjects, and overwhelmingly, I found the quality to be absolutely top-notch. Someone else asked me what I think of H.P. Lovecraft and his fiction, pointing out that he's a big influence in the horror genre, but also that, he was a big old racist. So first, I'll just point to the fact I actually did a video review for The Call of Cthulhu and Other Stories. It's the only review I've made of Lovecraftian fiction, but it is a big, chunky collection of a lot of the short stories written by H.P. Lovecraft, so if you're interested, you can check that out. More generally, I really like H.P. Lovecraft's fiction. I think it's fun. It's also creepy, not outright scary. I was never scared when I read Lovecraft's short stories, but it's definitely creepy, somewhat anxiety-inducing. There's a lot of existential dread, cosmic dread, because we're in the realm of cosmic horror, right? And I just really enjoy that. Like last week, I had an absolutely abysmal reading week. This week, however, I'm reading a third collection of Lovecraftian short stories, H.P. Lovecraft short stories. And I said to myself as I was, putting the books on my night table, good old reliable. I know I'm going to have a good time going through those short stories, even though a fair few of them end up being a bit repetitive, even though, I know they're going to be big, creepy, tentacled monsters and stuff. It's fascinating to see how big of an influence H.P. Lovecraft ultimately turned out to be on the genre of horror, and cosmic horror more specifically, from something something like The Thing, to Stephen King's prolific fiction, to something like Bloodborne, an absolute masterpiece of video gaming. So yeah, I think that definitely engaging, thoughtful themes in Lovecraft's fiction. Now, yes, he was a big old racist. I think from the little I've researched into his personal life, I think he was just a miserable sod. It's not an excuse for being a hateful sod either, don't get me wrong. But I think beyond the labeling of he was a racist, and that's true, I think he was just afraid of everyone, less so of like his fellow wasps, sure, but ultimately, yeah, I just get the vibe that he felt alienated from absolutely everything and everyone. He didn't understand other people, especially people of color or like Italian immigrants or Irish immigrants or the Chinese, and so since that was the unknown to him, the whole point of Lovecraftian fiction is fear of the unknown. Well, yeah, he was afraid of all that unknown, and he just channeled that massively into his fiction. Plus, I'm pretty far at the end of the separating art and the artist spectrum in favor of actually separating the art from the artist and, you know, death of the author and that stuff. I'm just very easily able to keep the two distinct in my mind. I care about the work first and foremost, and I evaluate the work first and foremost as its own thing, separate from whatever intentions the author might have had regarding the creation of that piece of fiction or piece of art, music, whatever. I've talked about this in my video review for The Myths of Avalon as well, if you want to check it out. So yeah, plus H.P. Lovecraft has been dead for, what, 100 years now? It doesn't really matter. Yeah, there are racist elements in some of his short stories which are distasteful, of course. I'm not going to argue to the contrary, but I can just kind of ignore those elements and have fun with the big creepy oozy monsters and the cosmic dread. You know what I mean? Too much is made about, ooh, H.P. Lovecraft should be verboten now. Like, fuck that, I'm sorry, I just don't agree with that. He's dead, he's long dead. I mean, there are much worse authors out there, including the writer of The Myths of Avalon, I might argue, though she's dead also. But so yeah, there are actual horrible people today who are racist and who do much worse things than writing in a few cringy racist elements in a short story about big oozy monsters. That's kind of my take on that. Also, fun fact, the way I got into H.P. Lovecraft's fiction was, I'm pretty sure after I'd read the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer, I was so mind blown by that trilogy that I wanted stuff that resembled it. And I read that The Color Out of Space was one of the sources, perhaps, of inspiration for, you know, Area X. I was like, I mean, I'd heard of H.P. Lovecraft before that, but that kind of spurred me on to actually reading his fiction. And actually, The Color Out of Space is one of my favorite stories by H.P. Lovecraft. Then a commenter asked me, is how I understood it, sorry if I understood it incorrectly, what books I'd read this year I thought should be translated. Thinking about the books I've read this year, or, you know, this year and last year, that I think should be translated into the other one of my native languages, and they might be already, I haven't checked. So definitely The Children of Time, Children of Ruin duology should be translated into French. I have a suspicion that it probably is, given its popularity, given it has won awards. I think the Winnowing Flame trilogy should definitely be translated in a lot of different languages, because I think it was a great fantasy or science fantasy trilogy. I mean, I've heard it's hard to acquire in the United States, and you lot share a language with the UK, so that's a bit weird to me, but so yeah, apparently it's hard to get. So I would imagine it's hard to get in a language other than English, which is a shame. My Dog Vanessa has been translated into French. Lolita, of course, has been translated into French and lots of other languages because it's a big classic. Le Consentement by Vanessa Springor has been translated into English. But I think that Putney should be translated into French and other languages, of course, but I mean, at least into French. If My Dog Vanessa was translated into French, Putney should be as well, most definitely. Anaïs sur la mer des mensonges, this magnificent graphic novel, should definitely be translated at the very least into English, but also into whatever other language, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, whatever. But at least the languages that Anaïs Nin spoke, and languages that would, you know, correspond to her cultural origins. But yeah, that should definitely be translated into English, if only by virtue of the fact that she wrote a lot of her own fiction in English, so that would make sense to me. Same kind of goes, though perhaps to a lesser extent, for Mademoiselle Baudelaire, which I read last month, written and illustrated by Hilaire. I think it would make for an appealing story to other language-speaking peoples, other cultures, even though So Charles Baudelaire is a staple of French literature, but he translated the works of Edgar Allan Poe into French. So to me it would feel right for a story about him and his relationships to be translated into other languages. I'd say this year I read The Priory of the Orange Tree. I think it's good enough to merit a translation. The Book of Dragons as well, as an anthology of SFF fiction around dragons, that definitely merits a wider audience than just the Anglosphere. A couple of picks which will definitely be more controversial, but I personally think that both Material Girls and Trance When Ideology Meets Reality, yes, I've read that one this month, should be translated into other languages than English, because I think those ideas, whilst more predominant in the Anglosphere, are coming to other countries than English-speaking ones. So those debates are going to happen in continental Europe, in other areas of the world, and we should be able to debate these ideas and have sources upon which to develop our arguments in other languages than English. Now, I was also asked a very difficult question to think of, mention my favorite romances in written fiction, despite the fact that I've made it pretty clear that I'm not a big fan of romance and fiction and have kind of a hard time understanding what romance even really is. But that's just a weird me thing. I've never really read a romance novel. I think I've read one, a historical romance, very, very long time ago called The Falcon and the Dove. I can't even remember the author's name because I don't know, it doesn't matter. Then I had a 5-minute internal debate about whether or not Lady Chadley's Lover could be considered a romance. I think it can, but maybe not in the generally accepted definition of the genre. I don't know, but I mean, yeah, there is a romance element, a pretty significant one too, in Lady Chadley's Lover. But I'm no longer a fan of that story at all. So I had to find romance elements, or couples, I guess, in the fiction I've read, which isn't necessarily romance-centric. I really enjoyed the relationship, the romantic / non-platonic relationship that develops between, yeah, sorry, there might be minor spoilers here, oops, between Tourmaline and Noon in the Winnowing Flame trilogy. So Tourmaline being a male Eboran, which is kind of like a vampiric elf, Noon being a human fell witch. I really liked that relationship. I thought its development was very organic. There was a lot of respect between the characters, a lot of consent at the heart of the few sexual relationships that they have, which is put on the page. And I mean, they're not super healthy individuals, but there wasn't any abuse. There was a lot of trauma they had to deal with separately, but they didn't take it out on one another. So I really enjoyed that. In that same trilogy, there's also a very convincing and heartwarming gay male romance. More recently, I read The Priory of the Orange Tree, and I quite enjoyed the lesbian romantic non-platonic relationship that develops between one of the main characters, Aed, and one of the main secondary characters, Queen Sabran. I was convinced by it. I enjoyed it for what it was. It was nice. So yeah, that goes on the list. In Hyperion, one of the main characters, basically the only main female character in Hyperion, not in The Fall of Hyperion, Braun Lamia, who is a detective, she develops a relationship with a cybrid character, so a human body housing an AI consciousness called Johnny, who's basically like an avatar of John Keats. There's not much of it on the page ultimately, but something about it felt right to me, and I liked it for the little bit I got on the page. Again, I'm not even sure anyone would qualify it as a romance as such, but there's a quite moving relationship that slowly develops between Tenar and Ged in the Earthsea cycle. You see most of that taking place in the 4th book, Tahanu. And it takes place between two people who are already middle-aged too, so, you know, later in their life with a different level of maturity than you would usually associate with, well, romance is taking place between much younger characters, protagonists, like there's a lot of romance in YA novels or romance between characters which are like in their 20s. Here, the loving relationship develops between people in their 40s, perhaps even a little bit older. A relationship which, again, not traditional romance as such, but it's definitely a very intense and intimate relationship. It does involve some sex at some point. It's a very complex relationship as well. because it involves very complex characters. It's the relationship between Morgaine and the druid Kevin in The Mists of Avalon. I really, really enjoyed the dynamic between those two characters, even though I guess the ultimate outcome of that relationship isn't a super happy one, but it's a complex story with complex characters, a lot of deep, intense, complex feelings involved and all that. But I thought that was a very interesting relationship, one which felt real in a way because it was complex, not straightforward and not lovey-dovey or what have you. More superficially, I also, I guess, kind of appreciated the relationship between Isaac and Lynn in Perdido Street Station, written by China Mieville. Isaac being a scientist living in New Crobuzon, and Lynn being a Capri woman. So Capris being humanoid-looking females, but instead of a head, they have a giant scarab beetle. So it's a bit weird, obviously, but I mean, weird fiction, so that makes sense. Their relationship also felt very respectful, independent. That's what I liked also, it was very independent. Like, they're not all over each other all of the time. They each have their differing spheres of interest and influence, but they come together and share those interests as well, kind of like an ideal scenario for me. And there is deep love between them. Like, the main male character, Isaac, is devastated when bad things happen to his lover and he wants to save her, but it's just not a possessive type of love either. And finally, even though I didn't love the very stereotypical trappings of it, I actually think the romantic relationship that develops between Helen Graham and Gilbert Markham was pretty good, in the sense that it starts out as a very deep, steadfast friendship that takes its time to evolve and develop before flowering into something traditionally romantic involving marriage and presumably sex, though obviously you won't get a mention of sex in that novel because Victorian era England. Now, another question was whether or not I have experienced world hopper fatigue, i.e. whether I can get burnt out on speculative fiction. I think the answer is yes and no. I mean, not really. However, I can get fatigued by works of SFF which have a huge scope, whether because of the sheer immensity of the world building or intensity of the theming, or because it's just a ginormous series. If I go through A Song of Ice and Fire, I kind of need a palate cleanser after that, though I could use a palate cleanser that is still speculative fiction. However, I've noticed that I do benefit from interspersing every once in a while an item of non-speculative fiction, whether it's something contemporary or a classic, for example. And then I have this wonderful feeling of homecoming when I go back to speculative fiction. So I definitely do find value in mixing up genres somewhat. What I do experience, though, is being burnt out by non-fiction. That's very, very real, especially because I can read about pretty depressing stuff, especially when it's like feminism related. There's a certain point where, okay, I have to stop reading about this because this is just pulling me down way too bloody much. Then I'll change it up with a book about birds, a book about animal behavior and animals being friendly and cuddly with one another, you know, things like that. Basically my equivalent of non-fiction eye bleach, if you will. Interspersing with graphic fiction and or graphic non-fiction, but graphic fiction mostly does help as well. The weird thing is I started reading like comic books and graphic novels pretty late in life. I never used to read comic books before the age of 18. If I just don't have the brain energy to devote to a big chunky work of SFF or a series of SFF novels, then just dipping into a graphic novel or even a series of comic books can be a really good dose of fresh air and just, yeah, a palate cleanser as well. And then I was also asked if I had any creative writing projects. I mean, yes and no. So, yes, in the sense that there are sketches of stories and worlds in here. And I have a shit ton of OCs that have been conceptualized to go along with those stories. So it's there in seed form. I have written a bit of world building for what I see as my main story/world project. I have 3 of them in total, but then because mental illness is a thing, because I'm shit at managing time, and because creativity is not constant at all, it hasn't really gone anywhere in a few years. So no, in the sense that for the moment it's all pretty dead in the water. Ideally, yes, I'd like to do something with that stuff, but I just don't know what's going to happen at this point. Now, I have a 3-part question regarding my reading history and the books I read in school and the books that I read in France/Belgium. Maybe a quick reminder, I'm not actually French, I'm Belgian. So yeah, I live in the capital of Belgium, Brussels. I was born here, raised here, lived all my life here. However, I do have French nationality as well. Perhaps, maybe this might be interesting. I've seen a few comments here and there being a bit confused, or I mean, nicely confused. It was never aggressive or anything like that, but how is it that you speak French and English the way you do? I was born, raised, lived all my life in Belgium. My mother is half Belgian, half English. My father is French born to French parents, but he and his parents emigrated to the States after World War II. I have older parents. My dad was born in 1944, so when he was 5 or 6, I can't remember exactly, his parents decided that we have no future in France, we're going to go and try our luck in the United States. So he grew up and did all his studies in the US. So we're all bilingual at home, and that's how I was raised. Now, my history regarding reading before Booktube. So if you're interested, I actually did a year and a half ago, a video which was titled My Year in Reading, something like that. I lifted off the idea from Rachel's channel, Kalanadi. Basically, you had to pair each year of your life with a book that stood out to you or just marked a significant turning point in your reading history. It's a fairly long video, but I really go through that history in detail. A quick summary of that, however, here. I started reading not that early, actually. I started out being more geared towards cartoons on TV and just dinosaurs and Pokemon. I loved Pokemon. And then I discovered reading with Harry Potter, basically. I know how unoriginal. Harry Potter, and I read The Hobbit in French also when I was like 10. I read the Narnia books, but then I was gifted Aragon by a relation of my godfather. It was in English, and that just blew open the doors of SFF literature for me. Via dragons, basically. I became obsessed with dragons. Dragons led me to books about dragons, which led me to wider SFF literature and then literature in general. So I really started becoming a bookworm around the age of 9-10 with Harry Potter, but then it really kicked off with Aragon, really. So that's why Aragon has a very special place in my heart. Not because I think it's the greatest work of literature ever, not at all, but it was my gateway drug, basically. And when it comes to what I read in school, perhaps first I should clarify how school works in Belgium, because again, I'm not French, and the Belgian system is a bit different to the French one. In Belgium, you have 12 years of compulsory schooling. You have 6 years of primary school, and then 6 years of secondary school. I guess in that respect, it's slightly more similar to the UK system, though again, not exactly the same. And so from the 3rd year onwards, French classes actually started to become literature classes, because before that, as I'm sure it is in other countries as well, in English-speaking countries and whatever other language-speaking countries, those classes are about learning how to write correctly and speak correctly and just, use the language correctly. Then past a certain point, you actually learn the literary heritage of your language and learn how to debate and write essays and things like that. So that started in the 3rd year of secondary school for me. So I had a fun time remembering all the stuff I read for school. Overall, actually, I didn't enjoy the vast majority of things I had to read for school. Thankfully, I had the benefit of reading for fun on my own time, so I could read through school assignments very quickly. Like, a lot of other students didn't understand the fact that I loved reading. But of course, if reading wasn't one of their hobbies and the only things they had to read was school assignments, I can understand that it wasn't the most pleasant experience. I'm definitely in favor of mixing in personal choice reads in literature courses. I do not agree with doing away completely with mandatory reading assignments and having to read certain classics. I'm a bit old school that way, perhaps, but sometimes you just have to read things you don't want to. I guess the attitude is somewhat a kind of, if I had to go through it, you'll have to go through it. But, that's just my opinion. A mix of both, I think, is the best course of action. And in fact, I had a mix of both. There were certain modules within my literature courses where I could choose from a list of works, or I could just choose whatever. And at times, I actually picked books I could read in English, which is a kind of cheating, I guess, but whatever, it worked out. So quickly, in English, I did read a few things. I read a novel by Doris Lessing. The assignment was we had to read a Nobel Prize laureate and then write an essay about them. So I read The Cleft by Doris Lessing. I once read The Chains of Liberty, The Chains of Freedom. Is a Ken Follett book about slavery because it was part of what we were studying in literature, and obviously the literature courses were paired with the history ones. So if we went through the 16th century in history, we would go through the 16th century in literature. I went to see Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett at the theatre. We went to the theatre several times. I was the only one who enjoyed that play. I thought it was hilarious and no one else got it. But in any case, the classics of French literature I read in third year Le Horla by Guy de Maupassant, which is a short story, pretty creepy short story in the genre called, in French, in any case, Le Fantastique. It's the kind of stuff that Edgar Allan Poe writes, really. There's some fantastical elements, there's a bit of creep, that general idea of things. I read these two, La Nuit des Temps and L'Enchanteur de René Barjavel, which is actually one of the only SFF writers I've read in French, funnily enough. Because, I don't know, the teacher in that third year really liked him, maybe? I mean, he wanted us to explore the fantastical in literature. So this is fantasy, Arthurian fantasy, and this is science fiction. Also, shout out to that amazing teacher, because he was amazing, and I also had him as a history teacher in my final year of secondary school, and he was awesome. And we also studied, like, medieval literature, oral literature, La Chanson de Roland and things like that. In 4th, 5th and 6th years, I went through the 16th to the 20th centuries. So I read something by Honoré de Balzac, which was profoundly boring. I can't remember which one it was though. It's one of the books in La Comédie Humaine, which is his big body of work. La Comtesse de something, I don't know, I can't remember. We could choose which one we would have to read. I chose one of the shortest I could find and was bored. I had to read Germinal by Émile Zola, which I hated, but I can recognize the literary quality of it. It's basically a work of journalism in a way. I mean, Zola was part of this current literature called naturalism, so it was like ultra non-speculative fiction. You had to write about real things and nothing else, and he chose to write about very depressing things. The life conditions of coal miners in the north of France, the rampant alcoholism of working class peoples in 19th century Paris. And he was big on social determinism, so if your parents are a certain way, you'll be a certain way, and your children will be a certain way. Germinal was very, very depressing, but it's well written at the same time. And it does depict what it was like to be a coal miner in that time. So I respect it, but I don't like it. I also had to read another, Maupassant, which was Bel-Ami, which is just this upstart dude trying to make a career in administration or something, and he's an unremitting asshole, and it was boring and I didn't give a crap. I had to read Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, which I also found pretty boring. I just didn't really care. Though, perhaps not as boring as what I had read by Balzac, I guess. I read Les Fleurs du Mal by Charles Baudelaire, but I read this on my own time. However, we did study him in class as well, alongside other poets of the 19th century. We studied also Les Liaisons Dangereuses by, what's his name? Choderlos de Laclos, so The Dangerous Liaisons. I don't think we actually read the book. I think we perhaps saw the movie with John Malkovich in class, because sometimes that happened. We could watch a movie to explore a certain subject. Then, of course, I saw the great playwrights of French literature, so Jean Racine, whatever his first name is, Corneille, Molière, because duh. The English study Shakespeare, we study Molière, and I saw several Molière plays. At the theatre, I saw Le Malade Imaginaire, and something to do with groups of women who were interested in literature. I had to read Don Giovanni by Molière as well. I saw at the theatre L'Orisation by Alfred de Musset. And then in like my last year, I read some of the big 20th century names like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. From Camus, I read Caligula, which is a play, but I had to read it, I didn't see it. And by Jean-Paul Sartre, I read Existentialism as a Humanism. Oh my god, I hated that. I had to read Les Mouches and Huis Clos. Huis Clos was kind of fun insofar as we acted out the play in class. We read it and acted out the play in class, so that was amusing. We also read, play acted La Cantatrice Chauve by Eugène Ionesco. I also read a novel by a reasonably well-known French author called Something Becbédé. It was a book about the Twin Towers terrorist attack and it was fine, but I didn't really care overall. What is popular in French literary circles? I don't know. Because I don't really read fiction in French. I read graphic fiction. I read non-fiction and graphic non-fiction in French, but when it comes to novels, I can't really actually help you because I don't myself know. I don't pay attention to what's produced by French writers. A couple of exceptions. I read a few historical fantasy novels written by an author called Mireille Calmel. I read the first two novels of Emma Becker, but I need to reread them, and I will be rereading them next year because I need to reevaluate some things in those novels. I read a bit of classic French erotic literature back in the day as well, but apart from super popular names like Marc Lévy or Guillaume Musso, is that his name? Or I mean, I know some hoity-toity pseudo-intellectual names which win the Prix Goncourt and stuff, but those are the authors I would never touch in a million years. So, and when it comes to SFF in French, I know nothing. I mean, apart from René Barjavel and Jules Verne, and perhaps something Weber, and a dude I read that wrote fantasy riffing off of the Arthurian mythos. I know nothing in French. I really don't. I don't know what's popular today. Who are the hip authors? I mean, I know a couple, like I said, but beyond that, nope, not my area of expertise at all. And finally, I was asked if I would ever consider doing a reading vlog or a vlog of me going into a bookstore, because they said they enjoyed seeing different kinds of bookstores in different countries. Not really, because A, I have social anxiety, so to begin with, I don't enjoy going to stores that much. I mean, bookstores are a bit of an exception, but I would be so uncomfortable and stressed if I were filming myself talking in a bookstore with people around me. That would just not work for me. And B, in any case, I don't really go that much to bookstores because since I read mostly in English and I live in a majority French-speaking area, it's not that easy to find exactly what I want in English in the bookstores that are around me. We do have like one Waterstones downtown, but I hate downtown Brussels, so I have no deep desire to go there regularly. Apart from that, we do have a few secondhand bookstores, but trying to find what you're actually looking for in that slog and mess of books is a chore. So yeah, I just don't have a great incentive to go to physical bookstores here. And when it comes to reading vlogs, I just don't think I'd be that interesting, to be perfectly honest. Also, I'm just not that good at spontaneous talking, commenting. However, I do say this, but counter offer, would any of you be interested in me trying out a stream? I mean, a live stream on YouTube, like for half an hour to an hour max, to talk about the books I've read. You want to ask me questions about the books I've read, about my bookish habits, whatever. Would that be interesting? I'm willing to try that, though I will probably be stressed and be a bit awkward, but that's just because that's the way I actually am in real life. I know that my computer can handle it, though my internet connection is not always super reliable, so that might be an issue. And also, I just don't know how many people who are subscribed to me or who watch me regularly are from Europe, are from the UK, well, UK, Europe, that's kind of the same thing time zone-wise, or are from the US or other parts of the world. So figuring out when I would try that out is also a bit of a quandary. I mean, I can find a compromise for that, basically. But so yes, again, a tiny little request to those of you who watch this video, but I'll leave this in my description as well. Would you be interested in a live stream, a shortish live stream, trying this out with me, basically? I could plan one for not too long after this video comes out, so maybe the following weekend or the following week. I assume that doing it on a weekend would be better because most people work during the week. So yeah, just let me know what you think about that. That's something I'd be willing to try out. So I've covered all the questions that were submitted to me. So once again, thank you to all of you who participated in this little Q&A by submitting questions. I hope I answered your questions in a satisfactory manner. I hope you found this interesting. Let me know if you want me to do this again in the future. Let me know also about that live stream possibility. I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Thank you for your support and all continued support. Take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you all again reasonably soon in another video.